So we're going to get started building a simple little game project to take a look at interactivity inside Unity. We'll take a basic look at some really simple scripting. We'll talk about adding interactivity to game objects and the different kinds of input you can get from the game engine and the player. And then we're going to jump right into Playmaker and introduce the whole concept of using a visual scripting environment versus something that we're coding from the ground up. And we'll kind of compare and contrast and talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages over the course of this project and future projects. And so I'm going to create my next exercise project. And so similar to Gravity Lab, this is going to be an exercise that's going to eventually segue into our next major project. But we're going to create just a simple little sandbox, little play area for us to experiment with some concepts. Now, before I do this, I want to point out that I have some content on my desktop that were some resource folders that went into my Gravity Lab project. I have my Gravity Lab, I have some builds, I have some resources, I have some models that went into it. So I have these 4 folders that I created. The first one, the Gravity Lab project, was my Unity folder, right? So I can look inside this and see that I have assets, library, project files. This is all the stuff that Unity put together for me. But if I go into the assets folder, you'll see that this is where we had all of the content that was available in our project tab inside Unity, where we had things like materials and models and everything else. So this is the folder that Unity put together, and I'm going to treat this as my project folder. I've created a Gravity Lab resources folder, and inside the resources are just some simple images that I wanted to reference for color. But I'm also going to take my builds and my Gravity Lab models, and I'm going to take all this stuff and just kind of drop it into the root of Gravity Lab. Now I want to make sure that I don't include this into the move this content into the assets folder, because that's part of the search path of Unity, and everything that's placed inside the assets folder, inside your project folder, Unity's going to search for it, try to make sense of it, and try to include it in your project. And a lot of times we can break projects by including resources that aren't being used directly inside of our game. So we want to keep those outside of the assets folder. Also, I want to point out that I'm doing a little house cleaning here, a little housekeeping, without the project opened in Unity. So here's my Unity project folder. I want to point out that my Gravity Lab project is referencing my desktop. Okay, now I'm going to quit Unity for a moment just to demonstrate something here. Just a moment for my Gravity Lab project, but I'm going to move my Gravity Lab project into a Game Design 1 Summer 17 folder. Now, if I do this with Unity open referencing this path, I might get a little warning or a little error. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quit Unity for a moment. I'm going to take my Gravity Lab project and I'm going to drop it into a Game Design folder. Now, this is going to be my class folder. This is where I'm saving all of my projects. So if I open this folder, I have some random resources here, and these are resources that I'm going to use across multiple projects. So I might just make a generic resources folder that's not dedicated to any single project and move some assets in there. I have my first project, which was Gravity Lab. Okay, and I might even include 01 in front of that. So if I want my projects to show up in sequential order, I can experiment with the naming conventions. Now, when I go back to Unity, you'll notice that my Gravity Lab project is no longer listed in this directory. It's because we moved the reference. When we built the project, when I demonstrated my Gravity Lab build, I built to the desktop. I've moved that project reference when Unity wasn't open. Now it can't find it, and so therefore it's not listing it. If I want to open this project, I would go to Open. I would navigate to my Game Design project folder. I would look for Gravity Lab, and I would hit Open. Okay, I don't ever want to move content for a project folder or reorganize any content when a project is open or when Unity is running. Okay, so it's really important that if I want to, move some stuff around, which until we get really comfortable with, moving assets and resources around, we want to be careful, but we also don't want to do that when a project's open. While this project's open, I do want to point out that my assets folder, if I look inside assets, I have all these different assets. If I go into my Gravity Lab project and I go into the assets folder, you can see that this content is listed here. Okay. In fact, if I make a new folder here, untitled, and I go back to Unity, that's in the search path of my project folder, and therefore I now have an untitled folder here. If I right click and create another folder, I get a new folder here, and I jump into my assets folder, and I should have something called new folder. There it is. Okay, so this assets folder in our project panel is talking to the assets folder of our project. It's important that we maintain this structure that Unity has provided for us. We don't want to rename assets. We don't want to rename the contents of assets on the fly, especially when Unity's open, because you'll break the project and break some of the references that are going on inside this scene. So it's just a little bit about some basic kind of housekeeping and organization. I'm actually going to create a new project now, so not a new scene, but a new project. This will take me back to the new project window, and I'm going to create a demo for our introduction to Playmaker, and I'm going to call this project, I could just call it Playmaker Test, or I'll call this Gong. And instead of saving this directly to the desktop, because I've created a Game Design 1 folder, I'm going to change the location to my desktop, Game Design 1, open. So I'm creating a project called Gong. Inside this location, it's a 3D project. At this point, I can start adding some basic assets. And assets are the asset packages that Unity provides to rapidly prototype a project. And so I'm not going to add anything just yet, but if we hit asset packages, so content that you download from the asset store or standard assets, and a few other things will pop up. We'll cover that in just a short bit, but I'm going to create my new project, and we'll talk a little bit about interactivity. And I'm going to mock up a really simple environment. It'll be a little bit of just some real quick review from our Gravity Lab project, but just kind of emphasizing some important workflow issues. And so I'm going to create a cube, and this cube is going to be the floor object. So I once again want a basic floor, and it's really important that we start naming the assets that we create as we create them, because as I'm sure you've noticed in our last project, we had a lot of assets. It's really easy to kind of lose track of projects, assets inside a more complex project. So I'm going to create this floor for now, X and Z at 50 meters and about 0.2 or 0.1 along the Y. Actually, maybe I'll make this a little bit smaller, 20. I'll make this a little bit smaller of a floor here. And I'll just zoom out with my mouse just a bit. And by default, what I like to do is I'm not going to rotate the floor, but I'm going to orbit my view. My default view, I want to look down the Z-axis. Okay, so I'm pointing the blue axis away from me. And in fact, that's the direction that the camera is adopting and pointing in. So I'm just kind of getting kind of close to where my camera is pointing. Now, I'm going to create another game object, and this is going to be cube. And for now, I'm going to let the cube remain, the name remain cube. And I just want to talk a little bit about adding interactivity or scripting to your game project. Okay. So what we'll do is now that we have this basic setup in place, in the next presentation, we'll catch up and talk about the different ways that we can make this cube interact with the game engine. But we'll do that in the next presentation.